Good morning. My name is Emily Dwyer. I'm the Policy Director at the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability, a network of 41 organizations and unions who have come together to ensure there are rules for business, rights for people, and respect for the environment. To that end, we're campaigning for mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation and to require Canadian companies prevent harms in their global operations. It is my enormous pleasure today to welcome two tremendous human rights experts who will be speaking about topics of great relevance to Canada. First, Mr. Robert McCorquodale, Emeritus Professor of International Law and Human Rights, barrister mediator at Brick Court Chambers, and Vice Chair of the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights. He has advised governments, business enterprises, civil society, international organizations, and other stakeholders from around the world about business and human rights issues for decades. Second, Elvin Hernandez is a human rights investigator with Fundación ERIC Radio Progreso, a Development and Peace Caritas Canada partner in Honduras since 2014. Mr. Hernandez works with rural communities in northern Honduras facing human rights and environmental abuses and struggling to defend their lands and environment. Without further ado, I will pass it to Mr. McCorquodale.
Thank you, Emily. It's my pleasure to be here. I don't come in an official capacity, but as a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. Part of our role is also to engage with businesses, with governments, with civil society, and with others in this kind of matters concerning corporate accountability for business and human rights. Part of the working group's role is to do country visits, and we did a country visit to Canada in 2018. We've recently done one to Japan, and we go to a variety of different countries around the world. In addition, we deal with communications. Communications are complaints brought usually by communities or labour groups or others about business operations anywhere in the world, and we've had some in the past in relation to Canadian companies. And we also undertake a range of different engagements such as this. We have an annual forum, and we also deal with various thematic issues. So, for example, a number of years ago, the working group produced an important report about what businesses should do in conflict situations, which of course has also had relevance today with various conflict situations which are happening in the world, and giving guidance about heightened human rights due diligence, which companies need to do. In addition, we have just produced a report just a few weeks ago on the extractive sector and just transition. Just transition is dealing with the move away from fossil fuels and trying to also deal with the human rights of those affected who, say, are working with the extractive industry or might be employees or communities, and how that can move forward in a way which also respects their rights. So those are the various thematic issues. The current one which we're working on is investors and the use of environmental, social and governance work, and how that actually includes or does not include human rights issues. But what broadly I'm talking about is the global change, the increase in significant global regulation in this area. And in doing that, the European Union, for example, is about to introduce a very important new regulation on this area. They've also had regulations on broadly the matter of social and other forms of engagement which include human rights, which corporations need to do. Of course, Canada has introduced their Modern Slavery Act, so has Australia, so has the UK. The US is doing a great deal in relation to customs and trafficking and other kind of engagements across borders, and many other states are introducing regulation on this at quite a considerable rate. There is already in place regulations in Germany, in France, and in Norway. And in addition, there's a range of case law which is happening, case law including very important cases by the Canadian Supreme Court, decisions in the UK Supreme Court, decisions in Dutch courts, and decisions also in other courts in the Global South, which are beginning to make it clear that corporations have a very clear and important duty in relation to their activities, which might be ones which have adverse human rights impacts. And that's important because very often we might see our own companies working in particular ways in the particular state they're from, but when they go elsewhere, they can be acting in ways which lead to abuses of human rights. And so this change in the approach to corporate accountability is considerable and is beginning to affect how businesses are responding. And there are many businesses today which have human rights policies and are beginning to recognise that actually this is important in many ways, not only reputationally, but also in relation to potential litigation risk, operational risks, and more generally the consequences if they are not dealing in these areas in an effective way, and particularly looking at remedies for those who are affected. And those remedies often require knowledge back from rights holders, from human rights defenders and others, which are important in terms of understanding what is actually happening on the ground in relation to matters of human rights protection for everybody affected by business activities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McCorquodale. Next, we'll have Mr. Hernandez coming to speak, and his interpreter will be coming up as well. Thank you, Camila.
Muchas gracias por la invitación a esta conferencia de prensa.
Thank you very much for your invitation to this press conference.
Vengo desde Honduras, un país con mucha riqueza en agua, en bosques y en tierras fértiles para la agricultura.
I come from Honduras, a very rich country for agriculture, a forest, and for the life in general.
Pero toda esa riqueza está amenazada fundamentalmente por proyectos extractivos, por proyectos hidroeléctricos y por los monocultivos.
But all that wonderful richness is threatened by mining projects, hydropower projects, and large crops projects.
En la última década se han entregado 507 concesiones mineras, 305 concesiones para proyectos hidroeléctricos y hay más de 200.000 hectáreas de palma cultivadas en la región.
In the last decade, more than 507 mining concessions have been granted, 305 permits to build hydroelectrical power have been granted too, and 200,000 hectares of land have been cultivated with these large crops.
Y todas esas concesiones operan en un país que apenas tiene 112.000 kilómetros cuadrados.
And all those concessions are operating in a very small country, which at the surface is
12.000 kilómetros cuadrados.
12,000 square kilometers.
El rasgo fundamental de todas esas concesiones es que se han entregado de manera ilegal.
The main sign of these concessions are all those concessions have been granted on an illegal way,
dejando un daño ambiental importante en el país, destruyendo ríos y amenazando a los defensores de los bienes naturales. Tan es así que nos hemos convertido en el país más peligroso para los defensores de los bienes naturales y para los defensores de derechos humanos.
All these illegal concessions have created a huge problem with on human rights, and they have created Honduras has become, for that situation, Honduras has become the most dangerous country for human rights defenders and for environmental defenders.
La estrategia de las mineras tiene como 5 pasos para implementar sus proyectos.
The strategy of those mining companies have 5 stages. It's a strategy of 5 steps.
Dividir la comunidad, poner organizaciones paralelas. En tercer lugar, denigrar a los líderes que defienden los bienes naturales. Cuando eso no funciona, van a una etapa de criminalización, y cuando, a pesar de la división, a pesar de las organizaciones paralelas, a pesar de la difamación, de la criminalización, viene la última fase, que es la eliminación física.
So those 5 steps are
división de la comunidad.
So the first step is the mining companies tend to divide the community. When it doesn't work, so they start making, trying to create parallel community organizations that will support them. When it doesn't work, so they start making defamation or promoting lies about the community. And when it doesn't work, so they go to the next step, which is accusing them of criminal acts, so what we call criminalization. And when the this last resort doesn't work to intimidate communities, so they pass to kill communities, right?
Una parte importante de las concesiones mineras están en manos de inversiones de canadienses.
One of the main mining concessions are on belongs to Canadian companies.
Y con frecuencia están en alianzas con élites locales que tienen unos rasgos muy violentos.
And most of the time, those Canadian mining concession companies have links with national elites who are very well known to be very violent in the country.
Por eso consideramos que la iniciativa para que el Parlamento de Canadá apruebe una ley sobre la ley de debida diligencia es muy importante, no solo para Canadá, sino para los países de Centroamérica, de América Latina y especialmente para Honduras.
That is the reason why we believe that promoting the due diligence in Canada and Canada adopting the due diligence is very important, because it will help to protect not only the human rights defenders, but the environment in general.
Necesitamos establecer límites a la manera como se está explotando las mineras, y esos límites hay que ponérselos aquí para que las empresas puedan rendir cuentas tanto en la explotación en el país de origen hasta el destino final de los productos.
It is necessary to establish limits to those mining operations, and those limits have to be established here and there in order to bring those companies accountable.
Estamos en un momento ideal para unir esfuerzos entre el sur global y el norte global, todos uniendo fuerzas para salvar el planeta.
We are in a very special moment in order to unite forces here in Canada and in other parts of the globe to come united to protect the life on Earth.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hernandez, Mr. McCorquodale. We hope that in your time here in Canada, in speaking events with civil society, the public, and Canadian decision makers, that Canada hears your call to respond to the needs of impacted people and to catch up to global best practice. So thank you very much, and we'll turn it over to questions now. And for that period, we'll invite Dean Detloff and Richard Rudishama to come up with us from Development and Peace to help answer some of the questions if there's any directed to them. Thank you.
For any reporters joining us on Zoom, please raise your hand now to ask a question. Si vous êtes sur Zoom, s'il vous plaît, utilisez la fonction lever la main. I don't have any questions, so if there's anything else you would like to add.
Any last comments, anyone?
No tenemos preguntas, si quieres adicionar algo más.
Okay. Normalmente en los países del norte nos suelen hablar de la importancia de la transición energética. Nos presentan la importancia o que el futuro está en usar carros eléctricos y que el futuro está en la tecnología y en ciudades inteligentes.
Usually in the countries from the north, they are promoting the use of the transition to green solutions like electrical cars and other green solutions like that.
Pero siempre hay que preguntarnos qué significa la transición energética para los países del sur y qué significa la transición energética para los países del norte.
But we always have to ask, what does it mean for us the power transition to the countries of the north, and what does it mean for the countries of the south.
No hay tecnología, por muy buena que sea, sin minerales.
There is not a technology for the best that it is that will not use minerals.
Y la reflexión más sencilla, porque va a ser la más cotidiana, es avanzar del carro de uso de combustible convencional a un carro eléctrico.
And in that regard, the most common thought is to make the transition from the conventional car to the electrical car.
Pero hay que preguntarnos cuál es la diferencia entre el combustible convencional que viene de los países de Siria, países árabes, con violaciones a los derechos humanos y destrucción del ambiente.
We have to ask what is the real cost of that transition with those conventional cars, for example, with oil extracted in countries where human rights are also violated.
¿En qué se va a diferenciar un carro eléctrico que necesita litio para las baterías y ese litio viene de países del sur como Bolivia o Venezuela con violaciones a los derechos humanos, con violaciones al ambiente?
And in the case of electrical cars, there is a need for lithium, and that lithium is going to be extracted also in countries of the south and in countries where high risk of human rights violation.
Y ahí es la importancia de volver a establecer límites a las empresas, por un lado, pero también que los estados tengan mecanismos para presionar a estas empresas a proteger los derechos humanos y defender el ambiente.
There is, so this is a case, for example, where it surfaced the evidence of the need for the countries to establish due diligences, legislations in order to put pressures on companies to prevent the human rights violations, but also to provide the mechanisms for those legislations to be implemented in reality.
Y debemos estar claros, los límites no los van a poner las empresas mineras.
And we have to be clear, the limits are not going to be implemented by mining companies.
Los límites solo serán posibles si hay una unidad en las fuerzas entre las iniciativas que vienen de Naciones Unidas con los estados y los pueblos.
The limits are going to be implemented only when all the forces coming from United Nations, from the communities, and from other civil society organizations will be united in order to make pressure for those limits to be implemented.
Una ley de la debida diligencia en Canadá va a salvar muchas vidas, no solo en Canadá, sino en el sur global, tanto América Latina y África.
Due diligence legislation here in Canada will save lives not only in the global south, but also here in Canada.
Ya que los datos muestran que el 60% al menos del capital invertido en minería en todo el planeta es de origen canadiense.
Because the data, the research has proved that 60% of the mining capital belongs to are from Canada.
Por tanto, esa ley de debida diligencia sería un avance importante para todo el planeta.
Therefore, legislation of due diligence is very important for the whole planet.
Y por eso me parece tan importante la iniciativa de desarrollo y paz y esta conversación aquí con el señor Robert.
That is why he finds the conversation with Development and Peace and Robert from the United Nations to promote this dialogue and move forward with this initiative.
Gracias.
The Working Group on Business and Human Rights relies on a major international document called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which has been accepted and adopted and implemented by a number of states. Two of those key elements, in addition to corporate responsibility to respect human rights, are that states must act to prevent corporate actions which lead to adverse human rights impacts, but also the remedy has to be a remedy to the victim. Now that is relevant because when we look at these changes in global regulation, we see that legislation which only provides for reporting but doesn't have any particular sanction about the action which the companies are doing is on the whole largely ineffective, and we've seen that from a range of other instances around the world. And further, if it's purely voluntary by companies, then the evidence once again is very clear that companies are not doing this in significant numbers. In addition, a fine to a company is not a remedy to a victim. And therefore what we've seen in this global regulation and this increasing amount happening around the world is that if the only requirement under the any particular law is for a company to report on their activities, but not to have any other consequences of that reporting, including consequences about their actual adverse human rights impacts, it doesn't have any particularly effective consequences either on corporate activity or in relation to protection of those rights holders affected by the corporate activity. And therefore, we would hope that legislation brought in by states include much more than reporting requirements and also consequences which are more than a fine by the company. And those are part of what the working group considers what are called a smart mix of legislative measures and ones which we would hope enables a greater protection worldwide of the human rights of those affected by corporate activities. And we're also always grateful for the activities of civil society organisations to ensure that there is a voice very often for those who are affected by business activities, because very often without that voice, those in, for example, in the United Nations would not always know what's happening in those activities. So we're very grateful for the engagement, including in Canada, by civil society and by human rights defenders in furthering the protection of human rights in relation to corporate activities. And we also hope that more governments and more companies begin to act on this in relation to their daily activities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.